Just to frame the discussion, there's at one point the Eleatic stranger, who is the sort of central figure of the dialogue. So the dialogue takes place between the stranger and Theaetetus. He speaks of the sophist in this way. The man, namely the sophist, is wondrous in his very being and utterly difficult to keep in our sights, since even now he's fled in very good and clever fashion down into a form that offers no passage for our tracking. So the problem then is how to think precisely this form of a figure that I'm identifying with imposture. So there are posers and there are impostors. The impostor is more insidious, more dangerous than we colloquially term a poser. Whereas the poser apes the manner, style, or presence of something, he or she nonetheless desires to be the thing that it can only appear to be. The poser's lack is a lack of techne, a lack of know-how or skill. And his lack of techne makes his identification and expulsion integral to the group of technicians' ongoing refinement and purification of their knowledge, of their art, techne. The poser's vulnerability lies then precisely in his or her desire to be recognized, we could say, in Edith Stein's discourse. Far from a threat, the poser's identity lies in the exposure of its lack. The inconsistency of its presence serves, in this case, to reinforce the possessor of knowledge. The radicality of imposture, on the contrary, so in contradistinction to the poser, concerns the danger of one who knows that she does not desire what the other has or possesses, does not desire the other's knowledge. Far more insidious, the impostor cannot then be simply corrected, since her truth lies in overturning the opposition between the correct and the false. If the poser is one who desires to belong, the impostor belongs without belonging, an outsider inside. The impostor, to borrow Heidegger's apt formula for the sophist, is the walking incarnation of meon, which is the Greek for non-being. So the impostor is the walking incarnation of non-being. So Plato's Sophist is perhaps the first treatise on imposture. The sophist, the paradigmatic figure of the impostor. A fraud, a sham, in German ein Hochstapler, or what Herman Melville terms a confidence man. An impostor is one who appears to be something one is not. Otherwise than being, the sophist is an imitator. Mimetes in the Greek, which Jacob Klein, for one, translates as impostor. In Plato's Sophist, namely the dialogue, this figure is also called an enchanter, a joker, a jester. Preferring to juggle words rather than pin them down, the sophist does not take the logos in earnest. This is because he is a debater, antilogikos. So anti-legein. So this term debater is quite literally somebody who's against the logos, which is also can be translated as speech or reason. So he does not work, in other words, the sophist does not work with or for, but against the logos. Anti-legein. A creature of contradiction, he appears where the logos stumbles or trips, excelling at placing the one who speaks at odds with herself. And it's precisely this character that we'll see that then suddenly makes the sophist, in this very ironic way, converge with the figure of Socrates, namely the philosopher, the one who also excels at making his interlocutors stumble over what it is that they think that they know. So the word imposture, which names here the manner, way, or mode of the impostor, derives from the Latin imponere. Im, namely into, in, on, or upon, and ponere, to put or to place. Imposture is in the place of, so to speak, and thus is related to position, positing, and imposition. The impostor posits or positions herself in the place of the other, and the other is thereby placed in the position of her absence. The impostor singularly attests to the paradoxical existence of non-being. If we are to attribute being to the impostor, if we are to attribute being to the sophist, which we do spontaneously when we identify the sophist, if we say there is a sophist, then we risk attributing that which is not to that which is, being to non-being. And this is the central perplexity, the central impasse that the dialogue unfolds. We threaten being's propriety. So when we attribute being to non-being, we threaten the very propriety of being. We threaten being's proprieties. We threaten being's proprietary relation to itself. The existence of the sophist, of imposture, imposes on the philosopher and on thought as such an inconsistent logic, what Lucullabart calls a law of impropriety, in which being would appear to exclude itself from being. So it assumes the place of its own absence. It would not belong to itself, attributable to that which it is not. The impostor then is both a permanent threat to the logos's, to speech and reason's inscription in being, a threat to the very meaning of being, imperiling the assumption that when we speak, we are indeed saying something, legein ti, so that all speech is a speech about something. But also the eminent occasion, so that in addition to being a threat to the logos, it is also the eminent occasion for philosophizing, which is thereby summoned to think what sense this apparent nonsense might have. It is the multiple guises of the sophist, the many masks of the imitator, the impostor's lack of a stable identity that makes this figure so slippery, so resistant to conceptual determination, and confronts philosophical thought with an unbounded multiplicity. The impostor is an archevillain within the Platonic universe, because it is the most sophisticated form of sedition, which the Eleatic stranger in the dialogue defines as follows. So sedition is the differing of what is by nature akin, arising from some sort of dissolution. This is how it's put in the dialogue. The sophist is then essentially divisive, embodying an ugliness of soul, since the sophist incarnates, quote, that everywhere ill-formed kind, lack of measure, ametrios, which is this notion of lack of measure. And ill-formed here is quite interesting. It's the Greek word is, I won't pronounce this properly, but deus eides. So it's bound up also with the notion of eidos, form. So it's a kind of deformation would be one way of translating it. So ill-formed, the sophist or the impostor becomes ill-formed precisely because he or she is a grotesque mixture of unnatural, incompatible types, a turbulent motion without end to direct its course or measure to assess its success, right? Without measure, ametrios. If, as the Eleatic stranger says, quote, whenever there is speech, logos, it's necessary that it be speech about something, and impossible for it not to be about something. If legein is legein t, then the sophist seems to be a mute obstacle to speech, which would be paradoxical since the sophist becomes a mute obstacle precisely by being utterly garrulous. In other words, from speaking constantly. So not something, so the sophist then, not something, but not nothing. Something that is not one, which is to say, not a one, and thus uncountable. Okay, so this is going to be one of the central ideas I want to develop, which I was thinking, I think Vera had this nice sort of description of all of the talks today as between a lot and too much. And I was thinking, well, my paper actually probably could be retitled Between Nothing and Less Than Nothing. So it's sort of it's going to be a kind of interesting inversion, I think, of that. But okay, so just to rephrase that last point, because I think it's crucial to what I want to think here. So that the way in which the sophist will operate is precisely by separating the legein from legein t. So from speech, it will be a speech that somehow severs its relation to something, and by doing that, it thinks not something, but something that is also not nothing. So it's precisely between something and nothing, something that is then not a one, something that is not one, which is then to say not a one, and therefore the sophist presents to philosophy something that is uncountable. And this is what we're going to sort of attempt to think. And this is Plato's point of departure. If the sophist's multiplicity is truly uncountable, how can sophistry be an art, that is a techne? How can it be a skill, a practice? If the sophist does indeed teach something, as they indeed claim and for which they are paid, then sophistry should be something learned. And if it is learnable, in Greek amathema, it must be accountable. And so playing with this notion of giving an account and counting, which Plato does frequently. So Plato thus approaches sophistry not simply as sophistication, an art of professing wisdom or appearing to be wise, but as techne sophisticae, an art of sophistication. One thus has to come to know what art it is that the sophist practices, and through determining this object, however slippery this fish may be, it can be hooked, dragged up from below, from the depths, from that dark pit by the mouth, namely by the instrument of speech. And the beginning of the dialogue begins with this discussion of the art of acquisition, where one becomes an angler who's trying to catch a fish. So sort of playing on that for those that might be familiar with the dialogue. So what is the art, the techne, that the sophist practices? It is, I'm here claiming, the art of imposture, of not being how one appears. It is it's an art of embracing the seam, namely the seam in a fabric, and most decisively the seam of language, of the logos. An art of embracing the seam of the logos. So it is the sophist's character then of antilogikos, of being a debater, of working in but against language, that philosophy will seize upon and attempt to purge. So philosophy will then act as a purgative that seeks to mend, to reform, to set straight the motley character of the sophist. And here I think character is interesting in the sense that in English it can both refer obviously to what we refer to as the character of a person, but also the signifier, the letter as such. So that and I think that the sophist will be interestingly positioned between these things. So character in the sense of personal identity, but character in the sense of how personal identity is always inscribed within a discourse that signifies, and thereby assumes the character of language. So anti-legane is not only an art of separating opinions, of refutation. It is also, the stranger argues, a poesis, a making. So anti-legane engages in the art, techne, of making, poesis, a spoken image of something. An image, eidolon, is likewise twofold. It is a likeness, an icon, or an apparition, phantasma. So this is the two Greek words, icon and phantasma, likeness and apparition. To make an image is to make something that is not. Not the thing that appears, but its likeness or its apparition. So precisely an image is something that lacks being. And is this the central conundrum then of the dialogue? How is it that we can speak about something that lacks being? The image is thus a form of non-being, which would make the image-making art, mimetike, mimesis, a kind of knowledge of non-being. But how is this possible? The sophist anti-legane, and so the sophist debating, is a poesis then, since it makes something that is not, namely an eidolon, an image. And in making an image through words as something that is not, it runs counter to the logos as legane ti, namely speech about something. It contradicts the literal translation of anti-legane, contradiction. It contradicts by positioning something then in the very place of its absence. To think the sophist, the mimetes, the impostor, is to think the place of what he makes or what she makes, the place of absence, the very place of non-being. As the practitioner of the apparition-making art, the impostor does not make a likeness, but an image that internalizes a relation to an absence and presents that absence as present. So this is where the stranger differentiates between the image as a likeness, which would refer to something, and what he's calling a phantasma or apparition. And this is the stranger. What do we call that which appears to be like, what do we call that which appears to be like the beautiful only because it is seen from an unbeautiful point of view, but which, if someone were empowered to see the things that large adequately, wouldn't even seem to be like what it claims to be like? Since it appears but is not like, shouldn't we call it an apparition, phantasma? Right? So this is kind of an interesting, it's often considered as a proto-analysis precisely of perspective. So it's the production of something from, what I'm saying, a point of view, but a point of view that's inscribed into the image precisely as absent. So the apparition is not an image that presents something. The apparition is not an image that presents something it is not, invoking an absent presence. That would be a likeness. An absent presence, in other words, which it is like. Rather, the apparition is not like the thing it presents, since it is made to appear in the very place of its absence. And the stranger says precisely, it is not beautiful, and not, it is ugly. The apparition is not beautiful because it presents its displacement of place. Okay, that's my interpretation. The impostor would thus be one who makes of oneself an apparition. And at the end of the dialogue, this is a passage, again, by the stranger. When the very maker of the apparition furnishes himself as the instrument, when someone uses his own body to make it appear to resemble your figure, or to make his voice like your voice, this part of the apparition-making art has especially been called, I suppose, imitating. So the impostor, right, which is very close to this notion of impersonation, but the impostor makes the place of the other appear. So the impostor makes the place of the other appear. And she does so by making one's own presence absent. Imposture would be a certain knowledge of the void of one's identity, the void of place, knowing that who one is not one, not something, but the absent place of the other. The impostor could know that he is, the impostor could know that she is, but not who or what he or she is, inhabiting the difference between his absent place and the form that comes to occupy it. The impostor must know not being by grasping the place of one's absence. So one is in both senses, in the sense of referring to the person that's absent, as well as being a person that can be counted as one. The claim to know nothing, meiden in the Greek, the claim to know nothing, or in English we can comically say, to be a know-nothing, sounds utterly ridiculous. Yet the sophist, as the stranger points out, is not an idiot, even if he often plays the fool. The stranger attempts to establish something shared between the sophist and the philosopher, even if it ultimately will entail parricide, so the killing off of Father Parmenides, and the thesis that being is, and therefore being is one. So even if it risks parricide, what the sophist and the philosopher share is a mutual opposition to idiocy. The idiotes, in Greek, is the purely idiomatic, consigning speech, logos, to pure noise, to utter noise, lacking all and any sophistication. If the idiot speaks at all, he grunts, reducing speech to the sheared index of a proper name, right? A kind of finger jab. It's an indexical that doesn't allow for the interrelations that allow speech itself to be possible to emerge. So that you could say the idiot is the one who denies relation as such, relationality. And this makes the idiot utterly ridiculous, as the stranger puts it, since he lays claim to a discourse that either immediately subverts itself as soon as the idiot opens his mouth, or is reduced to the most trite platitude, to what the stranger in the dialogue here refers to as elderly wisdom, which the stranger mocks, that simply sort of basically results in tautologies, such as man is man and the good is good. So the idiot would have to speak without forging relationships between things. This is a quote. Since they're powerless to keep these out, in other words, these relationships out of, and not to bring them into their speeches, they could only do so by remaining mute. They don't need others to refute them, but as the saying goes, they have their enemy and future opponent right at home, and as they make their way, they always carry around something uttering speech from deep inside, like that absurd ventriloquist Eurycles. Right? So that they don't, in other words, they're not in possession of what they say, they're simply the instruments of a little speaker in them, that's spoken from the back of their throat with a closed mouth, like a ventriloquist. Struck with wonder due to their poverty of good sense, they marvel at the complete vapidity of tautologies without being aware that through this insistence, they destine the logos to utter ruination, destroying signification and the very possibility of relation. So the sophist is not an idiot. The sophist is not an idiot, but a joker, making use of the logos not simply to deny it, but to make something of nothing. By bringing everything to naught, to the negative, the sophist thereby makes the very pretension to knowledge laughable. Capable of debating all things, the wondrous sophistic power, as the stranger suggests, makes the sophist appear wise and knowledgeable, but it is a practice that ultimately, for the stranger, or at least for Plato, imperils education, so paideia, by making of it a joke, paideia. So education in Greek is paideia, so the Greek word for joke is paideia. So there's this, obviously, of just a subtle shift. And paideia derives from pace, which is also sort of refers to childhood, the child, or a slave. And it's just simply this one signifier that separates it then from the Greek word for education. Conceived in contrast to seriousness, spude, the sophist is then a joker, a figure who relates to knowledge as child's play, and Plato plays with this slippage between joke and education. And the dialogue is an effort, and we can say that the dialogue is an effort to take seriously the sophist's play, in which he unanchors, namely the sophist, unmoors the letter that allows education to move from health to sickness, slipping from paideia to paideia, from integrity to incorruption. The sophist can appear to know everything because he knows nothing, and it is this fundamental inversion that makes the sophist a jester, a comedian, a figure of paideia. The difference between the impostor and the philosopher will thus hinge upon a single letter, a shift in stress that separates paideia from paideia. The philosopher will have to anchor this difference, the slippage of the letter, differentiating one enslaved to nonsense and the idle production of opinion from one committed to the joke's earnestness, its seriousness. Philosophy must educate the jester by thinking the joke. Rather than playing with language for laughs, Plato undertakes to think its condition in antilegane by neutralizing its contagious effects. In other words, this precisely this way in which a single signifier can make the word slip, its meaning slip. So philosophy must take seriously the task of knowing nothing, must take seriously the know-nothing, and thereby sever the bond forged by Democritus between thought and laughter. And so this is what one of the doxographers says about Democritus. Democritus was nicknamed wisdom and laughter because he laughed at the empty aspirations of mankind. The logos is no laughing matter for the philosopher. This endeavor to take the joke seriously risks parricide, the overthrow of Parmenides that enforced a separation between being and non-being in order to found the space of truth. To take nothing, meden, seriously is to put into question the relation between being and the one, as I've already suggested. Now I'm going to dwell on for a bit. So to locate the being of the sophist is incredibly perplexing, precisely because to think the being of the sophist is to think the being of falsity, the being of pseudos, the being which is in its essence non-essence, which is in its essence falsity. So one thus, as the stranger points out, dares to utter non-being, that is, one supposes that non-being is, and thereby stumbles into a trap of an irreparable contradiction. The ambition of Plato's sophist is to take the joke. So the ambition of Plato's sophist is to take the joke seriously, that is to say, philosophically, shifting the train from that of the joke, so from comedy, to irony. At least this is what I want to argue, or what I'll suggest. Whether I don't know how much I'll argue that, but let me that's I think an important claim, at least I want to make. So if then, and this is a passage from the stranger, if then not as a point of contention or a joke, but in earnest, one of Parmenides' listeners had to think it out and to answer the question, where must this name non-being be applied? How do we think we would use the name? For what purpose and for what sort of thing? And how would he show this to the one who inquired? So that's the question that now is going to be put to Parmenides by way of the sophist. The aim then is to kill or to neutralize sophistry's child play with earnestness, right? So it's going to take, you're going to be earnest about the sophist's non-being. Yet this neutralization requires confrontation with non-being and therefore risks parricide. If to speak is to say something, then language is always language about. Legein is legein ti. How then can falsity be discussed? For it is to speak about something that is not, something that is precisely nothing. The sophist is a figure who prompts the Parmenidean to violate the rule of his thought that separates being and non-being, and actually aligns truth precisely with the capacity to think non-being. So truth will actually be aligned with the capacity and articulation to think non-being, and not with the identification of being as one. So if not, non-being cannot be applied to either being or beings, the one or the multiple, for as one speaks of something, it itself implies a relation to beings. So this is a passage. To use some alone, naked and isolated as it were, from all beings, that's impossible. Right? So when one speaks of being, one speaks of beings, one speaks of something. And the stranger claims that there is a necessity that binds the relation implied by some to being someone. Right? And here Heidegger, I think, rightly discerns in his commentary on the sophist that every T, every something, co-signifies a hen, a one. In the broadest sense, a number. So this is the necessity of all counting and accounting. What is counted is a one. One counts something, which is to say, remaining more faithful to the Greek, someone. Quote, for you will say that singular sum is in fact a sign of one, dual sum of two, and plural sum of many. And so it's utterly necessary, it seems, that he who says not some, meti, is saying no thing, maiden. Okay, so this is an important passage. One says nothing, maiden, precisely because one says something about nothing, and thus counts the uncountable by treating it either as a plurality, non-beings, or as a unity, non-being. It is thus structurally impossible, given that legein is legein T, to, quote, utter or speak or think non-being all by itself. That is unthinkable, a dianoiton, and unspeakable, and irrational, so a legon. So non-being is that which most paradoxically is that which is most paradoxical, since it cannot be refuted. To say it is not to assign it a status that it cannot have. To say it is to assign it a status that it cannot have, and thereby puts the one who attempts to say it, the refuter, him or herself, into perplexity, into an impasse, aporia, for it forces the one who relates to it to say or think the opposite. To address it at all, even through the forms of negation, assigns to it a unity, the form of a one, betraying the fact that it is neither one nor many. One cannot thus speak correctly about it. Okay. I had a moment of panic there. I thought I'd forgotten a few pages, but luckily they were just hidden. So in order to speak of non-being, Plato has to suspend the legein T, in other words, this structure of the logos, marking the space between saying and saying something. He does this by suspending the one, establishing a relation between that which cannot be counted and the act of taking account of that which cannot be counted. There is some nothing that is, but this nothing which is itself cannot be counted. And this nothing that is, we shall call the unlimited, apparition. So it's this really interesting moment where this notion of it's this attempt to sort of subsume or take into the logos that is what is being deemed irrational, a logos, which is the unlimited, the apparition. And the Greeks don't have a word for the infinite, but obviously this would be it. So non-being takes the unlimited into account. But in being taken into account, it makes the one who speaks speak ridiculously. One has to say and think something genuinely strange, claiming the not as not being. Right? And this is indeed a strange way of speaking. Non belongs to being through being other to being. Thus we encounter the famous thesis of the dialogue. We could say it's radical ontological conclusion. Whenever we say non-being as it seems, we don't say something contrary to being, but only other. Non-being does not signify the opposite of being, nothingness, but only its other. Nothing. So there's this interesting distinction between nothingness and nothing, which is precisely why I suggested that what I'm interested in here is something between nothing and less than nothing. So the sophist has then been hooked with the very instrument by which he enters into debate, into antilegein. He has been hooked like a fish from below and by the mouth, because he begins to speak. As a form of antilegein, it has the capacity, the power to relate everything that is said to nothing. But philosophy must separate the nothing from itself, which is to say from being. right? And he does, and the philosopher will do this through introducing the form of the other, thateron. So there is no nothing that is not some, but the sum that nothing is not one. So let me repeat that, since I'm sure it's a little bit of a sophisticated way of speaking that probably, escapes the speaker as much as the listener in this case. Okay, so there is no nothing that is not some, but the sum that nothing is not one. So it's a logos against the logos that can articulate something that is in language but against language, but nonetheless has form. And this is the other and the unlimited. So the claim is, which is a radical claim, and hopefully I've done some way of framing why it is radical, not just for Plato and the Greeks, but I think continually radical, namely that there is a form, an eidos, of non-being, which is the other, thateron. The other is what separates being from non-being, prevents simply their identification, their collapse. So being is other to the others, and this way it is not. Being establishes its difference from beings through the other. The other then is defined as what is always in relation to an other. So this becomes important. So the other is defined as always in relation to another, and it is this definition that necessitates that being and the other are entirely different, right? So that if, in other words, if one did not say that the other is always in relation to another, one could therefore speak of the other or an absolute other, and then precisely the difference between being and otherness would collapse yet again. So it's important precisely to define the other as precisely something that denies its own status as form. So it's a form of the unform. It would be, it cannot include itself in being. So it'd be precisely a form of it's sort of an incipient form, we could say, of an empty space of place. So there cannot be an other that is, so to speak, absolutely other, an other that is not in relation to another. There would be no way of differentiating being and the other, and this is a quote, "If the other partook of both the forms you granted, as does being, there would be sometimes also be an other among the others that is unrelated to any other. And yet it has now inescapably fallen out for us that whatever is other is what is necessarily through another." So this is you can blame Plato for that formulation. So the form of the other is thus paradoxical, even if the stranger doesn't state this as such. In other words, it doesn't refer to the other as paradoxical, since it would be a form that is without limit, unbounded apparition. So how does one speak of a form of that which is precisely lacks form in the sense of how Parmenides understood it, which would be the sphere, right? So it would be, in other words, a kind of form that would be not whole. And so in that sense, it calls into question precisely this assumption that being is one and whole by Parmenides. So it's I think what's interesting here is we see how Plato is really at the very limits of the cosmological view that the Greeks had, that would re-articulate itself in very different conceptual terms within modernity. But we see Plato here already really at that limit. So how am I doing on time, by the way? Am I okay? I don't know. So the stranger says, this is a quote, "Then regarding each of the forms, being is many, while non-being is unlimited in multitude. Being is other to the others, and therefore many, by virtue of the form of the other, since it mixes with everything that is, but in being other to the many, the other to the other many others, so to speak, the others are not and are thus unlimited in multitude. The form of the other is apparition, an unlimited multitude." Quote, "Then we must also say that being itself is other than the others, and also that however many the others are in relation to so many, being is not. For insofar as it is not those others, it is itself one, and again, it is not in relation to those others which are unlimited in number." Right? So that the being relates to beings through the other becoming indefinitely multiple. So it produces a kind of uncountable multiplicity, which allows then for itself to nonetheless always be counted as one. So that, in other words, intelligibility is saved by creating a kind of exterior limit to thought that is positioned nonetheless or attached to beings. So non-being then cannot be original. It's not that one cannot say that nothing is as an identity or as a one. One says the nothing is other. So non-being then is produced as a kind of movement of expansion through being's identification with beings, through its being countable. And so I don't feel competent exactly to discuss it, but I think it is interesting that the Greeks didn't have a concept of zero, but there's a notion already, sort of an implicit notion of zero operative within how the structure of the thinking here is unfolding. So the nature of the other is thus not to be a one, to be unlimited and unaccountable. In separating being from the other, being is always a being that is countable as one, even if many. Being makes the other thinkable as non-being, the other of being, repeating the separating of being and other through an infinite procedure of counting. Since there's no other to the other, right? And this is precisely the key point, that there is no absolute other to otherness. Its nature, as the stranger says, is all chopped up. So it'd be a kind of parts that do not, a multiplicity that does not form into a whole. The other is as distributed through the unlimited multitude of what is not. It is the very relationality of things. So, end of this section that is sort of dealing with, let's say, the hardcore, so to speak, of the discussion of being in Plato's Sophists. And there's aspects of that discussion that I left out, but hopefully, nonetheless, how I discussed it is somewhat clear. So let me now move towards my conclusion. So on this account, then, comedy and sophistry is not philosophy's opposite. It's not the negation of philosophy, but it's philosophy's other. An other that philosophy will then incorporate in order to found the philosophical conception of truth, which requires that non-being itself is thinkable, right? Because if non-being itself is unthinkable, then one cannot show whoever one is speaking to that they do not know what they think they know. They have to precisely know nothing, even though they think they know something, in order for the very distinction between truth and doxa, truth and opinion, to be established, which founds knowledge as such and philosophical discourse. So impersonation then, or what I'm calling here the impostor, however, is not merely the assumption of a false identity, but we could say the disavowal of a true identity. In putting forth an identity, the impersonator impersonates another. But in doing so, the impersonator does not believe in that identity. He does not think he or she is that which he or she appears to be. Insofar as the impersonator says I, right, and this is something that I'm sort of very interested in and is sort of at the core of my book, what does it mean for one who's an impersonator to say I? Right? They can't say I as the one they're impersonating, but in the act of impersonation, they are no longer their I. So what then is the status of the speech that assumes the position of the I in the act of impersonating, in the act of imitation? So insofar as the impersonator says I, this saying is constitutively insincere. For the I that speaks is not attributable to a self, but to the me that appears. Not the subject, but the person, right? So that the impersonator will always attribute their personality to the other that they are impersonating. And then the assumption, of course, let's say the everyday assumption is that, oh, but we of course know that there's a difference between who the person is when they're not impersonating and their impersonation. But what I'm trying to think here is that the very condition of possibility for impersonation implies that one is in the place of the other. So that, in other words, one has to, it's not so much that one occupies the other's place on the other side, so to speak, but one displaces oneself and allows another to to be parasitic on it. So it's much more about the im is not strictly speaking a negation, but at the same time it's not a something. It's the lack of place that the impersonator can assume in order to personify something, or I mean someone or something. So in this case, I think there's interesting resonances with Vera's paper, but maybe also some differences that would be interesting to discuss. So the impersonator asserts, as a matter of practice, that the I is never where it appears to be. And like the lion in a midsummer's night's dream, the impersonator can state, I am the lion, and I am not the lion, but snug. Okay, that's from the play. But the impersonator plays with this gap between the I and the me, right? As I suggested at the beginning, this is taken from Duchamp. Forging an identity that eludes a determinate grasp, shifting perpetually from the position of the subject to that of the object, as if saying, the lion is me, but I am snug. The I of the impersonator is fatally split. I am and I am not who I say I am, right? That would be the sort of irreducible two-ness of the impersonator. It has to say I as the other, and can only be mediated through an act that assigns it a proper name. Now the proper name, and this maybe will relate also to Vera's, the proper name allows the opposition to be attributed to a subject that mediates the gap between the I and the me, enabling a me to designate an I. So that would be its social function, insofar as that one is interpolated when you call, if I hear Alexi, I'll turn and call me. So that in this instance, the notion of the proper name precisely serves to conceal the seam, so to speak, that erupts with impersonation. And so that I think actually my own discourse would be closer to, I think, one of the questioners, that would be what's being designated here is through the exposure of the proper name as being improper is precisely a singularity of the absence of identity. And it's sort of why the Edith Stein's text last night really resonated a lot with me in this regard, because it was very much predicated around the critique of identification, or a critique of identity, and personal identity in particular. Okay, so then the subject would be constitutively improper. And this is no doubt, I think, what Theaetetus, the other character, and the stranger discover in their pursuit of the elusive figure of the sophist, who always seems to be out of place, unable to be pinned down or disguised. Even if we grant that in the end, right, the effort of Plato is precisely to pin the sophist down, to pin him to non-being, but non-being as inscribed within being as the unlimited expansion of being's own determination. Right? So in my account anyways, the sophist then is inscribed as one who then can allow for the production of philosophical sense rather than one who truly resists it. And as they pursue the tortuous path of this protean figure, they cannot help but step into a trap that ultimately is intended for their prey. At the end of the dialogue, they encounter the enigma of their own philosophical image, distorted, disfigured, caricatured in the face of the sophist. In looking for the sophist, they find instead the philosopher, but it is a philosopher no longer then in control of the logos, no longer in control of its own image. They encounter, in short, a philosophical impersonation. So we could say, what really does it mean to actually impersonate philosophy? The dialogue ends as a kind of warning to know who it is with whom one speaks, since not even philosophy can be fully insulated from treachery and betrayal. Philosophy requires a minimum of trust. If unanchored from being, discourse, or speech, the logos becomes a treacherous medium, and all the more so if mobilized with nefarious intentions. The philosopher is counseled to admire the act of treachery, to study its workings, but hate a traitor. And it is not accidental that the sophist does not appear as a subject, namely as an interlocutor who speaks, but only as an object of the discourse. As an object, the sophist can be depicted archetypally as the figure who overturns the authority of the logos, unbinding it from its capacity to signify, to designate, to represent, but it nonetheless can then serve to reinforce the logos. An impersonator is not a viable interlocutor, since he undoes the legitimacy of the logos by not recognizing that the eye of the speaker is committed by speech to abide by the law that necessitates consistency in one's speech. If one does not know with whom one is speaking, then the eye of the other cannot be relied upon to recognize either the truth or falsity of what he or she is saying. They truly lack a measure. The speaker who speaks is thus not responsible for their speech and cannot be held to account. As such, the authority of the logos that depends upon the mutual recognition that signification cannot intend its opposite, this minimal criterion of consistent rational discourse, is challenged by the figure who does not accept this principle of identity. So this is the insidious and subversive nature of sophistry, its power to make that which is the same other. And we should perhaps not be surprised that in the end we encounter this being whose very being consists in being other, the sophist, in its other, the philosopher. This is the final irony, a token of Plato's deep respect for this enemy of truth. Lacking in identity, the sophist can only be glimpsed in the distortions he or she induces in its other, in philosophy, just as the figure who claims to lack knowledge can only be exhibited through exposing the falsity of the opinions of those who claim to know. In other words, philosophy cannot speak to, but only about sophistry. One has to recast sophistry then in the image of philosophy in order to force its submission to a rule of discourse that it itself does not recognize. And even this is, of course, a is tricky, as the inversion of the sophist and the philosopher portends. Even as an object, it threatens to subvert the philosophical subject, and this is because, as an object, it embodies negativity itself. Okay, thank you.